By early December of 1952, Alain Bombard had been alone in the Atlantic for about 50 days. He was 27 years old, sitting inside a tiny inflatable boat, surrounded by more water than he could possibly imagine. And he was preparing to die. His blood pressure had dropped, he was bleeding from his mouth, his body was exhausted, and there was still no land in sight. So he opened his journal and began writing what was basically his will. He left a few personal instructions. Then he added one final thought. Even if he died out there, he believed the experiment had already proved that a castaway could survive for 50 days. Then he put the notebook down, stretched himself between the inflatable sides of the boat, and waited. Which would make this a fairly normal shipwreck story. Except Alain Bombard wasn't shipwrecked. His boat hadn't sunk. Nobody had abandoned him. He had put himself there on purpose. Because Bombard was a French doctor with a strange idea. He believed people lost at sea could survive much longer than most people thought. And instead of publishing a paper about it, he decided to cross the Atlantic and test the idea on himself. About half an hour after lying down to die, something absurd occurred to him. Eventually, he imagined, this little raft might wash ashore. People would find a dead man inside it, along with a notebook explaining how not to die at sea. The contradiction made him laugh. So Bombard sat back up. Apparently, he wasn't finished yet. To understand why a doctor would voluntarily climb into an inflatable boat and disappear into the Atlantic, we have to go back 1 year. In 1951, Bombard was a young medical intern in the French port city of Boulogne-sur-Mer. One day, a fishing trawler went down nearby. 43 sailors died. Bombard later remembered seeing their bodies brought in together, and the image stayed with him. But there was another question that bothered him. People didn't always die the moment a ship sank. Some reached lifeboats, some survived the initial disaster, only to die days later from exposure, dehydration, hunger, or simply because rescue never came. Bombard became obsessed with one question. How long could a person actually survive at sea if they knew what to do? He also became convinced that morale mattered. In Bombard's view, a castaway who believed death was inevitable might stop fighting long before the body had reached its absolute physical limit. Now, there is an important distinction here. Positive thinking does not make dehydration, hypothermia, or starvation disappear. Those things can kill you perfectly well regardless of your attitude. But Bombard wondered whether people were also being defeated by something psychological. The belief that once their supplies were gone, the story was already over. Bombard began studying marine survival at the Oceanographic Museum in Monaco. Food was one problem. Water was another. And water has a particularly cruel sense of humor when you're stranded at sea. You're surrounded by it. Millions upon millions of tons of water. You can see it in every direction, and most of it can make your situation worse if you drink it. Bombard began looking at what the ocean itself could provide. Fish could provide food. Plankton could provide nutrients. Rain could provide fresh water. And Bombard believed there was another possibility. Fish flesh contains water, and he experimented with extracting fluid from fish. More controversially, he also believed that small amounts of seawater, under specific conditions and combined with other sources of water, could play a limited role in survival. And this is where we need to separate Bombard's theory from modern survival advice. Drinking seawater is dangerous. The salt concentration is too high for the human kidneys to deal with efficiently. To remove that excess salt, the body can end up losing more water in urine than it gained from the seawater in the first place. So, if you're ever actually stranded at sea, Bombard's story is not permission to start drinking the Atlantic. But in the early 1950s, this was part of the idea he wanted to test. Fish, plankton, rain, limited seawater, and one human body. There was really only one problem left. He needed an ocean. Bombard's choice of boat did not make the experiment sound any more reasonable. It was a small, inflatable Zodiac, only about 4.5 meters long with a simple sail. He named it l'Hérétique, the heretic, which was pretty appropriate, because a lot of people thought his ideas were somewhere between controversial and suicidal. Bombard didn't immediately point the boat toward America. He first carried out trials in the Mediterranean with a British sailor named Jack Palmer, and the early tests were not exactly perfect. During one of them, the two men struggled to catch enough food and eventually accepted emergency supplies from a passing ship. So, technically, nature had already given Bombard a fairly obvious opportunity to reconsider. He did not reconsider. Palmer eventually left the project. Bombard decided to continue alone. After the Mediterranean trials, Bombard made his way toward the Canary Islands. From there, he began the Atlantic crossing alone. He was 27. He had a sextant, a small sail, fishing equipment, and an inflatable boat that was much closer in size to something you'd use near a beach than something you'd normally choose to cross an ocean. The experiment was simple in theory. He would avoid living from normal stores of food and fresh water. Instead, he would try to take what he needed from the sea, and at first, it actually seemed to work. Bombard caught fish. He collected plankton. Flying fish sometimes landed in the boat at night. He extracted liquid from fish. When rain came, he collected it. And every day he made notes about what was happening to his body. For a while, this strange, floating laboratory seemed to be doing exactly what Bombard wanted. But there was one part of the experiment he couldn't control: the Atlantic. Life became repetitive very quickly. Wake up, check the sail, look at the horizon, catch something if you can. Eat, collect water if nature happens to provide it. Check the horizon again. Sleep, then do essentially the same thing tomorrow, and the day after that. Bombard had set out to test whether despair could become a part of a shipwreck. Now he was building an unusually good experiment for answering his own question. Because there was nobody else in the boat, no conversation, no city lights, no changing landscape. Just a small yellow raft sitting inside an enormous blue circle, and his body was deteriorating. In his later account, Bombard described long periods of diarrhea, skin problems, vision issues, moments when he nearly lost consciousness, and even losing toenails. He was constantly wet, constantly exposed, and gradually getting thinner. This was no longer the adventurous beginning of an experiment. This was just his life now. And possibly the worst part was that Bombard was trying to navigate an ocean despite having very little practical experience with a sextant. So he could calculate where he thought he was. But there was no blue dot on a screen telling him whether he was right. Every morning he could believe land was getting closer. And every morning, the horizon looked exactly the same. Bombard's entire system depended on nature cooperating at least a little. If he caught fish, he had food and another potential source of fluid. If it rained, he had fresh water. But the ocean does not care about your research schedule. There were periods when rain was scarce. There were periods when fishing was difficult. And this is the point where the romantic version of the story starts falling apart. Bombard was surviving, but he was not thriving. His experiment wasn't proving that this was a good way to live. It was proving that a human being could remain alive under conditions that were slowly tearing him apart. Which is a very different thing. And eventually, after weeks of the same ocean, the same boat, and the same uncertainty, Bombard reached his breaking point. Early December, roughly 50 days into the Atlantic ordeal, Bombard believed he should be approaching the other side, but there was nothing there. No island, no coastline. Nothing that told him the journey was actually coming to an end. His body was in terrible condition. His morale collapsed, and he wrote his will. Then came that strange half hour from the beginning of the story. Bombard lay down to die. He imagined his corpse washing ashore beside a survival manual. He laughed, and then he got back up. Nothing physical had changed. He wasn't suddenly healthier. There was no fresh water delivery. The boat hadn't magically moved closer to Barbados. The only thing that had changed was that Bombard had decided not yet. And then, not long afterward, something finally appeared on the horizon. Unfortunately, it wasn't land. It was a ship called the Arakaka. After weeks alone, Bombard was brought aboard for about an hour and a half, and the captain gave him something Bombard desperately needed: his actual position. Bombard's navigation was wrong, not slightly wrong. According to his later account, he was off by roughly 600 miles. Imagine thinking you've nearly finished crossing the Atlantic, and then someone politely informs you that the Atlantic has several hundred extra miles prepared for you. Bombard was also given food: a fried egg, a tiny piece of veal liver, some cabbage, a few pieces of fruit. Not exactly a banquet, but after weeks living almost entirely from what he could obtain at sea, it was enough to remind his body what normal food was. And that created another problem. His appetite came roaring back. Bombard later said the meal was followed by severe hunger and stomach cramps. He even claimed the sudden return to normal food nearly killed him. But despite finally having contact with a real ship, he didn't end the experiment. He went back to L'Hérétique. The Arakaka sailed away, and Bombard was alone again. The final part of the crossing was brutal. Bombard suffered stomach cramps. He dreamed about food. He continued losing weight, but now he had one advantage he hadn't had before. He knew where he was. The uncertainty had changed. There was finally a real destination somewhere beyond the horizon. So he kept moving west. One day, then another, until, after about 65 days in the Atlantic, something changed in the sky. Bombard saw the glow of a lighthouse reflecting against the clouds. This time, it wasn't another ship. It wasn't his imagination, it was Barbados. On December 23, 1952, Alain Bombard reached Barbados. He had crossed the Atlantic in a small, inflatable boat. He had spent about 65 days on that part of the journey, and he was alive, barely looking like the man who had started it. Bombard had lost roughly 25 kilograms, about 55 pounds. Reports describe severe anemia and a body badly weakened by the crossing. So if the question was, can somebody do this and come out perfectly healthy? The answer was clearly no. But that wasn't really Bombard's question. His question was whether a castaway, deprived of conventional supplies, could keep himself alive far longer than people assumed. And standing, or probably barely standing, on Barbados. Bombard had made that argument very difficult to ignore. Bombard returned to France as a celebrity. He wrote about the journey in Naufragé Volontaire, the voluntary castaway, and spent much of the rest of his life working on survival at sea. His voyage became influential in discussions about life rafts, fishing equipment, and what castaways could obtain from the ocean itself. But there is an important catch. Not every part of Bombard's theory survived as neatly as Bombard himself did, especially the seawater idea. His claims were challenged. Other survival researchers disagreed with him. And modern medical guidance is straightforward. Seawater should not be treated as drinking water. The kidneys simply cannot remove that salt without sacrificing water in the process. Keep doing it, and dehydration can get worse rather than better. There are also reasons to be careful with the legend that developed around Bombard. He accepted a meal aboard the Arakaka. His earlier Mediterranean trial required outside supplies, and surviving one extraordinary voyage does not transform every method used during that voyage into good medical advice. But none of that makes the story less interesting. Actually, I think it makes it better.